Hey, everybody, and welcome to a deep dive that's going to take us straight to the heart of Texas, to a legal battle that's brewing over something you might not expect: salt.
Yes, salt. You know that stuff we sprinkle on our food.
Exactly. But this isn't about seasoning, folks. It's about a major royalty dispute that's shaking up the Lone Star State. We're diving into MYERS-WOODWARD v. USM.
And this case is a real head-scratcher because it all goes back to a deal made way back in 1947, a deed for a piece of land in Texas.
Texas and old deeds. That's a recipe for a legal showdown.
Sure.
So what did this 1947 agreement say?
Well, it outlined royalty payments for the usual suspects: oil, gas, sulfur. Stuff Texas is known for.
Sounds pretty standard. But I'm guessing there's a twist.
Oh, there's always a twist in Texas land deals. The deed was later amended to include a royalty for all gas or other minerals.
Okay, so they added salt to the mix.
Right. But here's the kicker. They didn't spell out how that royalty would be paid. That little detail, that's what's causing all the trouble.
So you've got USM, a company extracting tons of salt from this land. And you've got the MYERS-WOODWARD family, who believe they're not getting their fair share of the profits. Enter Professor Robsleyer and his legal team, representing one of the petitioners in this case. What's their game plan?
Professor Robsleyer is making a pretty bold argument. They're saying the royalty should be based on the market value of the salt at the point of production.
Hold on, break that down for me. Well, what does that mean in plain English?
It means they want to be paid based on what the salt is worth when it's first dug up, not the lower price USM claims after they've processed it and shipped it off.
So it's like saying, pay us for the raw material, not the finished product. Makes sense to me. But I'm sure USM has a counter-argument.
Oh, they definitely do. They're likely going to point out that the deed never actually mentions market value. And that's where things get tricky.
So it's a battle of interpretations.
Exactly. Now, to support their case, Professor Roblier's team is using something called the comparable sales method. They're looking at what similar salt is selling for in the area.
So they're saying, look, here's what the market dictates. This is what our salt is worth.
Right. And they've got some legal precedent to back them up. There's a case by Bluestone Natural Resources that used a similar approach.
So they're not just pulling this out of thin air. There's legal muscle behind it. Yeah. But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If the deed doesn't say market value, doesn't that create a pretty big obstacle for the petitioners?
It definitely does. And that's where the work of Professor A.W. Walker, Jr. comes in. He's a big name in mineral rights.
Okay, so what does this Professor Walker have to say about all this?
Well, he basically laid out two ways to handle royalty payments when a deed is silent on the specifics. You either deliver the mineral in kind, meaning the actual salt, or you pay based on market price.
So Professor Roblier's clients are essentially picking and choosing the method that benefits the most. Doesn't that weaken their argument?
That's a good point, and USM would likely jump all over that. But the petitioners would argue that their claim isn't about choosing a payment method. It's about how the damages should be calculated. They're figuring out the royalty basis and figuring out the actual damages owed. Those are two separate things.
That's a clever legal maneuver. But hold on a second. Haven't they already shown their hand by asking for a declaration that the royalty be based on market value at the point of production? Doesn't that contradict what they're saying now?
That's where things get even more interesting, because now we're talking about election of remedies.
Okay, you've lost me. Election of remedies. What's that all about?
Basically, it means that once you choose a specific legal remedy and get a final judgment, you can't go back and try to get a different one that contradicts the first one.
So are you saying Professor Roblier's clients are stuck with their initial request?
Not necessarily. They argue that their previous action doesn't actually qualify as an election of remedies.
Now I'm really confused. Explain that one to me.
Think of it this way. They're saying that asking for a declaration on how the royalty should be calculated, that's a separate issue from figuring out the exact amount of damages they're owed.
Okay, so it's like two different legal battles.
Exactly. And they probably bring up the Bocanegra v. Aetna life insurance case to support their argument. That case clarified that you only have an election of remedies if you pursue a final judgment on one claim while knowing it clashes with another claim you could make.
So they're threading a very fine legal needle here.
Absolutely. But wait, there's another twist in this salty saga. We haven't even talked about the implied marketing covenant yet.
Another legal curveball. Lay it on me. What's this implied marketing covenant all about?
It means that USM, the company doing the extracting, they have a duty to sell the salt in a way that benefits both themselves and the royalty owners. They can't just strike a shady deal to lowball the price and cheat the MYERS-WOODWARD family out of their fair share.
I see where you're going with this. So if USM sold the petitioner's share of the salt, shouldn't they be paid based on the actual money they made from those sales, minus any reasonable costs, of course.
You got it. That's exactly what Professor Oblater and his team are arguing. They'd likely point to cases like Chesapeake Exploration v. Hyder, where the Texas Supreme Court had to figure out what gross production really meant and how to handle those post-production costs.
So the petitioners are basically saying, look, you can deduct your legitimate expenses, but you can't use processing and transportation costs as an excuse to pay us peanuts.
Precisely. It's a matter of fairness. They're saying don't punish us because you chose a complicated and expensive way to get the salt to market. Pay us based on the value of the raw material we own.
This case is getting more and more interesting. It's not just about salt. It's about the fundamental principles of fair play in these kinds of mineral rights contracts. This could have implications far beyond this one Texas salt mine.
Absolutely. This case has the potential to send shockwaves through the entire mining industry and maybe even beyond.
Now we're talking. You know, I love it when a seemingly simple case opens up a Pandora's box of legal and economic questions. So give us the bigger picture here. What are the broader implications of this dispute?
Well, imagine this. The potential value of royalty payments based on projected production can be very different from what those resources are actually worth once they're dug up and sold. This is something that's come up in tax cases where the IRS is trying to figure out the economics of mineral ownership.
So are you suggesting that a company can't just lowball royalty payments based on some hypothetical best-case scenario? They have to pay up based on the actual market value of the stuff they're pulling out of the ground.
That's the heart of the petitioner's argument, and they're finding parallels in other big-time royalty battles, especially in the oil and gas world.
Oil and gas legal drama is always a recipe for a wild ride.
Oh.
What kind of precedents are Professor Rob Leiner and his team likely to leverage in this case?
Well, there are a couple of landmark cases that could come into play. One is Mobil Oil Corp v. FPC, a case that dealt with the Federal Power Commission's power to regulate natural gas prices. The court basically said that royalty owners weren't bound by the FPC's price ceilings and could potentially go after higher payments based on the actual market value.
So even if a government agency sets a price, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the final word when it comes to royalty calculations.
Exactly. And another relevant case is First National Bank in Weatherford v. ExxonCorp. This one involved a dispute over gas royalty payments, where the landowner argued for payments based on the higher prices found in the unregulated intrastate market, even though the gas was technically under federal price regulations.
Wait, how could they demand a higher price based on a different market if the gas was under federal regulations?
That's exactly what Exxon argued. But the court in that case allowed evidence of sales in the unregulated market to paint a clearer picture of what the gas was really worth.
So the court basically said, we get that there are regulations, but let's not pretend those regulations always reflect the actual value of the resource.
Exactly. And that same principle could apply here in the MYERS-WOODWARD case. Even though there might not be a perfectly comparable market for salt, the petitioners are arguing that USM can't use processing and transportation costs as an excuse to undervalue their share of the royalties.
It all boils down to fairness, doesn't it? They're saying don't penalize us just because you chose a more complex and expensive way to get the salt to market. Pay us based on the value of the raw material we own.
That's a great way to put it. They're fighting for a royalty that reflects the true value of the salt at its source the moment it's extracted from their land.
But this brings us back to a major hurdle we discussed earlier, the fact that the original deed doesn't explicitly mention market value. How can Professor Rob Leiner's team overcome what seems like an insurmountable obstacle?
This is where their legal strategy gets really creative. They're essentially weaving together multiple lines of argument to build a strong case for their clients.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through how they plan to connect these seemingly separate threads.
They're likely going to argue that the all gas or other minerals clause in the amended deed shows that the parties intended to include salt in the royalty scheme. And just because the deed doesn't explicitly lay out how to calculate those royalties, that doesn't mean the intent wasn't there. They'll point to the comparable sales method and cases like Bluestone Natural Resources as evidence of how courts have determined market value when contracts don't have specific language.
So they're saying, look, even though the deed doesn't screen market value, it's clear that everyone involved wanted us to be compensated fairly for the salt taken from our land. And here's how the courts have figured out fair market value in similar cases.
Exactly. They're building a case based on both the spirit and the letter of the law, combining legal precedent with common sense about what fair compensation means in these agreements.
This is fascinating. It sounds like Professor Rob Leiner and his team are attacking this from all angles, building a multi-layered argument that can stand up to scrutiny. But what about the potential fallout if they win? Could a victory for the petitioners in this case have unintended consequences for USM and other companies in similar situations?
That's a great question. A ruling in favor of the petitioners could have a big impact on how USM and other companies structure these royalty agreements in the future. They might have to go back and look at existing contracts, maybe renegotiate terms, and be much more careful about the language they use in future agreements.
So this case could ripple outward, impacting not just USM, but the entire mining industry and maybe even other industries that rely on resource extraction.
It's definitely something to think about, and it raises some interesting questions about finding the right balance between protecting the rights of landowners and making sure that industries that depend on natural resources can stay afloat.
This deep dive is getting more and more intriguing. We've gone from a Texas salt mine to a potential legal earthquake that could change how we value and pay for natural resources across multiple industries.
It really highlights how complicated things can get when you mix legal precedents with real-world economics and how people interpret contracts.
This case has definitely made me think differently about salt, something I usually just take for granted. But before we all run out and stock up on our favorite seasonings, let's get back to the core of MYERS-WOODWARD v. USM. What's the big question the court has to grapple with?
Well, they have to figure out if the original deed, even though it doesn't explicitly talk about market value, can be interpreted in a way that supports the petitioner's argument for a higher royalty based on what the salt is worth right when it's pulled out of the ground. They've got to consider all those arguments about comparable sales, the implied marketing covenant, and that whole election of remedies thing, all within the context of this particular contract.
It's like they're putting together a puzzle, but some of the most important pieces are missing. But I have a feeling Professor Rob Lear wouldn't be involved if he didn't think they could win this thing.
You're right about that. Professor Rob Lear is known for taking on tough cases and coming up with some pretty creative legal strategies. And that leads us to a final thought-provoking question for our listeners. If the petitioners win, what kind of ripple effects could this have on other industries, not just mining?
Ooh, now you've got me thinking. Could this case set a precedent for how royalty payments are calculated for other natural resources?
It's a real possibility. What if the court decides that salt royalties have to be based on market value at the point of production? Could that same principle be applied to other resources like timber, for instance? Could landowners start arguing that they deserve a royalty based on the value of trees before they're cut down and processed?
You've just opened up a whole new can of worms. It's like a domino effect. This salt case could potentially trigger changes in royalty disputes across tons of industries.
It's definitely a fascinating scenario to think about, and it shows how a case about something as basic as salt can shake up entire industries and make us rethink how we value and pay for natural resources.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've gone from a salt mine in Texas to a potential legal turning point, all thanks to Professor Rob Kager and his clients fighting for what they believe is fair. It just goes to show that sometimes the most ordinary things can spark the most significant legal battles. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never underestimate the power of a good legal mystery.
It really shows how intertwined legal stuff and economics are, and how the words in a contract can have so many different meanings.
This case has definitely changed how I think about salt, that's for sure. But before we all go crazy stocking up on seasonings, let's get back to the heart of the MYERS-WOODWARD case. What's the bottom line? What does the court have to decide?
They got to figure out if that original deed, even though it doesn't come right out and say market value, can be read in a way that supports what the petitioners are asking for, that higher royalty based on the salt's value the second it's mined. They have to weigh all those arguments about similar sales, the implied marketing covenant, and that whole election of remedies concept, and see how it all fits within the specific contract.
It's like a legal jigsaw puzzle with some pieces missing. But I bet Professor Rob Lear wouldn't be involved if he didn't think they had a good shot at winning.
You're right about that. He's got a reputation for taking on complicated cases and coming up with some pretty clever legal strategies. And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for our listeners. What if the petitioners win? What kind of impact could this have on other industries beyond just mining?
Ooh, now you've got me thinking. Could this case set a precedent for how we calculate royalty payments for other natural resources?
It's something to consider. Imagine this. The court says salt royalties have to be based on market value at the point of production. Could that same idea apply to other resources like timber? Could landowners say, hold on, we want a royalty based on what those trees are worth before they're cut down and turned into lumber?
Wow, you've really opened up a whole new can of worms. It's like a domino effect. This salt case could end up changing royalty disputes across a bunch of different industries.
It's an interesting scenario for sure.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how a case about something as simple as salt can potentially turn things upside down for entire industries, making us rethink how we value and pay for the natural resources all around us.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from a salt mine in Texas to what could be a major turning point in how we handle resource extraction, all thanks to Professor Rob Blair and his clients fighting for their fair share. It just goes to show that sometimes the most ordinary things can spark the most important legal battles. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and remember, you never know where a good legal mystery will lead you.